it's so obvious to those of us that have looked at this stuff for a long time that the one-size-fits-all education system is incredibly regressive, and maybe that's why the data shows that there's across the board there is bipartisan support for doing something different. But why don't these arguments work in Washington, D.C.?
I think all the arguments are excellent for funding the students directly. I don't think there are any good arguments against it. But sadly, it's not only about the logic of your arguments. A lot of it has to do with power dynamics. And one thing that shows this problem is when you start thinking about other programs that already do fund students directly. Just think about it. When it comes to higher education, we have Pell Grants for low-income students, and we have the GI Bill for veterans. And when it comes to pre-K, we have pre-K programs where the money goes to the family, and families can choose public or private provider of the services. Just like with Pell Grants, you can choose a public or private university of your choosing. And a lot of the people who support funding students directly when it comes to higher education and pre-K, they get all up in arms when it comes to K-12 education. And the only difference that I can see is, again, the power dynamics differ. Choice is the norm when it comes to higher education and pre-K, but choice threatens a K-12 government monopoly when it comes to the K-12 education system.
You talk about power dynamics, and they're in, at least at the top of the pyramid in Washington, D.C. We are now into the new Biden administration, and I believe on his first day in office, he came out with a COVID executive order that said at least we're going to reopen the schools, but it doesn't really do that. What does it do?
It sounded good at first, right?
Yeah.
But then if you start reading more into it, he's calling, it's kind of a nod to the teachers union. It's throwing billions and billions of more dollars into the system, even though we've already added more and more federal funding to the K-12 education system over the past year. We had the CARES Act, about $13 billion going to K-12 schools. We had the second stimulus bill, about $50 billion going to the public school system at the K-12 level. And now he's proposing about $130 billion more to go through the K-12 public school system, which is close to the size of the Marshall Plan that the U.S. dedicated towards rebuilding Europe after World War II. So this is a ton of money, and it's coming from the federal government, which should have no role in K-12 public education, but here we are.
Yeah, so it's $130 billion in dedicated funding to schools and $350 billion in state and local relief funds to help school districts close budget gaps. And again, to our initial point, they're getting $130 billion for not doing their jobs.
Yeah, when a private school underperforms, it shuts down. When a public school underperforms, it gets rewarded with more money.